Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Norwich Talk 4, a Norwich City themed game of keep, loan, or sell. You join myself, Benjamin Bloom, and Connor Southwell for what is going to be an interesting discussion regarding Norwich City's squad. As you know, by the title, you can tell it's a game of keep, loan, or sell. It does what it says on the tin. It's very simple. But before we dive in, chaps, I'll go to you first. Ben, how are you? Are you doing well? How's your season been?
No comment. I'm great. I just remember talking to you, Ben, at the back end of the 20. Oh Christ, I forget my years. The one of the ones you won the title the second time, and this would be a conversation then preparing for the Premier League. I feel this is going to be a different conversation.
Yeah, slightly different. It's kind of we always seem to get you on this channel at the time of the review, and I think the first time you appeared on here was when Connor was still here and he presented, and it was a championship title win. And then with myself a couple of seasons ago, another championship title win. As you say, it's going to be the dead opposite in terms of tone this time around. Hopefully next year it'll be another championship win. Who knows? Connor, my man,
Knowing you
how are
guys,
you?
yeah.
Yeah.
I'm good. I'm good. Yeah, not too bad at all. Trying to get a little bit of rest here and there after the season ends. So that's one plus side of being in the playoffs. I'm trying to look at everything that's happened positively. So this is going to be an interesting conversation, I think, and it's going to be interesting to hear the thoughts of Ben, yourself, and everyone watching and listening as well.
I think absolutely. I think some people might think that for you this off season is a little chance to rest, but I can imagine it's probably the complete opposite, especially with the shape that Norwich City finds themselves in. This idea of a rebuild. Ben, as I'm sure you're aware now, the narrative has shifted from sort of Dean Smith and David Wagner not giving up on this playoff dream to, look, we go again. We rebuild. That is what's going to have to happen. Now, let's dive straight into Norwich City's squad. What I've done is I've got up the squad on Norwich's website, and we're going to perhaps mention in passing players whose contracts are set to expire and Norwich City are going to release. Timu Pukki amongst that list. And I've kind of looked at first teamers who could, perhaps should be here next season. And we'll go through it in order, as you'd expect. And we'll basically say keep, loan, or sell. Obviously, we shall discuss them a little bit more. And I feel like I'm going to say this for most of the players. We start with an interesting one. Tim Krul. Ben, I want you to take the lead on this. From the outside, Tim Krul, a seasoned championship pro. If you were to say whether Norwich City should keep, loan, sell, what are you thinking from the outside?
Well, I think you need to keep on the basis of what you've just said, not necessarily to, and this depends how much money there is in the coffers, but you don't take these type of people who have been there, done it, World Cup, Premier League, Championship, promotion. I remember chatting to Connor in one of those behind the closed doors games, and even when there was no fans there, these type of people who are even going and saying to Guy, put the music on in the stadium, get the atmosphere going. That type of leadership, whether they're playing 30, 40 games, and let's be honest, keeper, it's either all of them or none of them. I just feel if there's the money, you need to keep those guys around.
Connor, for you, one of the sort of thoughts I had in my latest video, which was yesterday, and it was kind of relevant to Ashley Barnes and this idea of bringing experience in. One of the things I said was, I don't know if you can really rely on, and I think it might be a bit harsh, but I don't know if you can continue to rely on this idea of that Norwich City still have players who have won the championship twice, because it's a fact, it's true. However, the past two seasons, especially, those players who were part of those title winning campaigns are still going to be reeling from the trauma of being embarrassed week in, week out in the Premier League, and now a very poor championship season where Carrow Road did turn pretty toxic. Do you think that point of, existing championship winner remains as sort of relevant as it did once?
Um, I think it can do. I think it depends on the side and how much change you instigate. I look at a team like Sheffield United. I remember when they came to Carrow Road and they still had Chris Basham, Billy Sharp, Ollie Norwood, John Fleck, but they were all on the bench. So the side had kind of churned, but those players were still in and around it. And actually, they were players they looked to bring on later on in that game to try and see it out. So that's kind of where I feel I am with a lot of those experienced players that Norwich have, to be in a position where they're not playing every single week, but Norwich is still able to extract value out of them. And we get to a stage where it's almost a bit more sort of evolution than revolution. I think that would be vitally important, because for as much as we talk about change, Norwich City's squad is still by and large incredibly young. So I think those players can still have value. Tim Krul, for instance, I've seen him at numerous points in the second half of the campaign almost become like an additional coaching voice on the sideline, with David Wagner and his backroom team. So I think you can get a lot of value out of these guys even if they aren't playing, and that can be intangibly inside the dressing room. It can be little words and advice. And Alex Tetty was brilliant at this in the behind closed door season. Just every kind of half time, arm around the shoulder of Ollie Skip, just giving him a little word or two that actually can be so valuable. So that's kind of where I'd like Norwich to kind of move to, where you've got these players in reserve and they're there if a game's a bit difficult and you're away from home and you're winning, just to bring on, and they're able to kind of manage it. I think that's the stage that I'd like to see Norwich City get at. In terms of Tim Krul, I think my position has shifted pretty drastically. There was a stage where I probably felt it wasn't healthy to have kind of two number one goalkeepers, so to speak, at the football club. But I think now, actually, if you could keep him around and you could lean on that leadership and you can extract as much value out of him as possible, then I think there you've got someone who's perfectly capable of pushing Angus Gunn, of being that competition. So whilst I wouldn't be against Tim Krul moving on this summer, I certainly wouldn't be against him kind of keep or staying at the club either. So I think he's a really interesting one, but I think I'm edging a little bit more towards keep than I was a few weeks and months ago.
So for you, Ben, keep for Tim Krul for Norwich. Okay, yeah, I think I'm going to agree.
Yeah, not to play. I pretty much agree with everything Connor just said. Not to play 35 games, but as well as I do, if the position opens up, he won't let you down, will he?
No, I think that's absolutely right. And again, if Norwich are to perhaps reinstate or build on the previous culture that was at the club, someone like Tim Krul, who was there in the thick of it for such a long time, will be a really important part of that. I'm going to say keep as well. He is 35 years old, just turned, and I think you're right, Ben. He's not going to expect to play loads and loads of games, but providing he's happy, I think he'll understand his role. Culturally, he'll be a very important player. An easy one for me, Angus Gunn has to be a keep. Ben, again, you first from the outside. I think without my Norwich City hat on, especially stats-wise, I don't actually have any to hand, but he seems to be at the top of many of these leaderboards, if you will. With Angus Gunn, just an outstanding goalkeeper, right?
Yeah, I'd agree. And what's going to be a theme here is assets. And sometimes it's not just about what they're doing on the pitch, it's the value on the balance sheet. And this is a very expensive goalkeeper from Man City to Southampton, wasn't it, that you've got playing in the second tier. That's even without the links, obviously, that he's got genetically in terms of your club. And yeah, the numbers always seem to be good on the goals prevented stats and the saves per match and all of those nice ones. So yeah, it's not just about clean sheets and stats. It's about when you're in the Championship, how many players have you got in your pocket that are of high value that you might need to trade at some point with FFP and whatnot. And there's probably going to be 3 or 4 where we're going to be saying, okay, is this a potential high value player on the pitch and also on the balance sheet?
Well, that's always been the model, hasn't it, Connor? Trying to sort of sell on these players, right?
Yeah, it is. And as for much as you can look at players and pinpoint them and go, I believe they're assets and I believe clubs will be interested in them. And you probably do that more with obviously the defensive duo of Andrew Mbamidele and Max Aarons. Ultimately, that's one thing that clubs cannot control. What players other clubs find attractive. And I'm sure there would be clubs that find Angus Gunn very attractive. Whether there's any clubs that would be willing to pay what Norwich City would demand for him is probably a different question. But for me personally, I think he's really grown this year, and actually since he's been at Norwich. I think when he was at Southampton, he got kind of beaten down rather harshly with that 9-0 defeat to Leicester, which he was kind of scapegoated in just because he was in goal that night, which seems a bit harsh. I think we've seen him rediscover his confidence. I think we've seen him win that race to be Norwich City #1. I'd still like to see a little bit more from him in terms of the elements away from the shot stopping. His statistics for that are always really good, but I'd like to see him be a bit more authoritative between the sticks, lead his defence a bit more, claim crosses a bit more. But yeah, like you say, just a very, very good goalkeeper, especially at this level, one of the best in the league, in my view. And I think we'll see that when that's kind of, if it's extrapolated over the course of a 46 game season next year. So, if Norwich City can keep him, and on the basis that no clubs find him attractive, I think he's definitely one that you'd be looking to kind of build and shape that team around next season if possible.
Yeah, that is a fairly resounding keep then. I'm obviously on that side. And where I sit at Carrow Road, which is bottom tier of the River End front row, I completely agree with what you say, Connor, about this idea of he's not particularly vocal. I don't see it as a massive criticism, but as you say, Ben, if he's going to go on to be this sort of high fee transfer that either funds Norwich or just sort of keeps them afloat, that side of his game will need to improve, because these football scouts, they know what they're doing and they know what they're looking for. Let's get on to the defenders then. Max Aarons, first one. I'm going to dive straight in and just say sell on the basis of that someone will pay 10, 11, 12 million pounds for him. He's got, am I right, Connor, in saying he's got 1 year left on his contract, which isn't particularly favourable. We saw with Todd Cantwell, didn't we, how he had that move to Bournemouth, which could have been 11 million pounds, and then the contract got ran down. Eventually went for peanuts to Rangers. Max Aarons for me is probably a sell. Ben, for you, is it time to cash in for Norwich?
I mean, I would bow to your guys' superior knowledge on the prevailing mood on the player. As an outsider, I remember having conversations with you guys as well. There was like 5 names, wasn't there? It was Webber, Farker, Buendia, Pookie, and Aarons was always the one of these guys, keep them together. And I mean, Jesus, look at all of that quality. I've heard people say he hasn't, because I think end of 2019, going into the Premier League, we were all, pick a number, any number, telephone number, you'd add 10 on and 10 on and 10 million on again. Now, how good can this guy be? And he's going to play for England and all of this. And it's not quite gone, into that stratosphere we thought he would. I think he's one of a number of players who, and I think he's brilliant, but he's one of a number of players that the little Argentinian fella just elevated, could seem to do that for everybody, didn't he? So I don't know the prevailing mood around him. I think he's a superb player, obviously, and especially with the caveat of the contract being only a year remain. And that always kind of works for the seller and the player and the agent a bit more than it does the parent club, doesn't it? Which isn't great, is it? So perhaps it is a sell on that basis, but love the player, superb.
Yeah, well, there's another player who we'll speak about just after, Ballymamba, who has just won League One Young Player of the Season.
I can tell you all about him.
Yeah, exactly. I'll be turning to you for that expertise. But this idea that this League One Young Player of the Season essentially will just take his place, Connor, surely it's got to be thank you very, very much, but goodbye, Max.
Yeah, and I think, sometimes we look at players and they can get viewed on value purely by what they're sold for, right? And maybe value for money or whatever. But I actually think you have to look a little bit deeper with Max Aarons, the value that he's provided Norwich City as an academy product, as someone they've developed over a long period of time, invested a lot of resource, time in, coaching into. I think they've got value for money regardless of how much he goes for this summer. So yes, it won't be the figure that was touted a few windows ago, and I always felt that was a little bit ambitious because I think, to be honest, his position isn't particularly helpful. I think you tend to get more for centre backs than you do full backs as a general rule of thumb. But for him to play over 200 games, to have been as consistent as he has been over a prolonged period of time,
never gets injured, does he?
No, and that's kind of the best testament to him, isn't it? Always available, always there. And I remember the big thing that sticks in my mind with him was it might have been even the day that the Barcelona stuff came out. Norwich were playing Preston at home behind closed doors, and it was just like he just kind of shook it off and got on with it. It was excellent that day, and I think that kind of sums him up. Where a lot of young players have, been kind of turned by speculation and in some cases kind of regress under it. He's really thrived and just kind of kept what he is, and I think what he excels at is always being a 7 out of 10, and there's not many players who are able to do that. A lot of players' performances fluctuate. So I'm really intrigued to see where he ends up, because I think the soundings around him have always been that Premier League clubs have been put off by his height and the fact that he would probably get kind of exploited airily. So I wonder if we'd see him make a move on the continent. In Germany's an interesting market, I think, for him. So yeah, we'll see. But I think you're right. I think it all kind of adds up with the Barley Mumba dimension to it as well as probably being the summer where Max Aarons moves on. And I think most Norwich fans would wish him well if that was the case that panned out.
Yeah, I think, is it Wolfsburg, the latest club to be touted with Max Aarons? Or
They've all been linked to him. Name a top club, they've all been linked to him.
Yeah, they all have. I think the thing with Max Aarons is he's hit a ceiling and he hit it fairly early on. But as you said, Connor, the important part there is it's not like he hit the ceiling early on and regressed. It was just
plateaued, hasn't he? He's just plateaued. I think the interesting one for me is I know that Carlo Ancelotti was a very big fan at Everton, and obviously the summer where I think he probably would have got the wheels in motion on that, he decided to go to Real Madrid. So there's been luck involved in why he's had to remain at Norwich City. But yeah, overall, I don't think you can argue with his contribution and his attitude and level of performance, because we've seen other players not view it in the way that he does on the pitch. So yeah, he's been wonderful for Norwich, and Norwich have been wonderful for him, I think.
Yeah, let's say sell. Let's say see you later, Max. But thank you very much for an unbelievable contribution from an academy product as well. Bally Mumba then, Ben. Tell me about him. Tell me about how much you love him.
Well, I don't love him when he's scoring injury time goals against Ipswich, but no, really, really good. I mean, it's interesting you see him as the replacement for Aarons, because he's pretty much played down as a left wing back. So different, different side of the pitch, different system as well, with it being a back three rather than the back four. Lovely technical player. Spoke to some Plymouth fans at the Pizza Cup final. Did say they liked him as a wing back, and sounds like a cliche, but better, going forward, getting into the other half than maybe sitting back and doing lots and lots of defending. But I suppose you expect still Norwich to be having more possession than less, and being higher in the table than lower in the table next season. So, yeah, really, really good loan. I mean, if you're going to loan a player down a division, you can't get much better than them winning the league title and getting lots of representation. So, yeah, the only question is, it's not always a home run in terms of players stepping up, but really smart from Norwich in terms of being able to sign a player, have someone else develop them, and then reap the rewards. He's just got to, if he's going to replace Max Aarons, he's got to, get used to playing down that side, which won't be an issue, and working in the slightly different system. But yeah, very, very, very smart work that, I have to say.
I find it bizarre from a Norwich fan point of view, the idea that we've sent a player out on loan and they've done really well, and another club has perhaps fallen in love with them, and they're going to come back here. Usually from a Norwich City perspective, it's and I'll mention Oliver Skipp, dead to us, God rest his soul. He's just an example of how Norwich will fall in love with a loan player and they'll go and we'll never see them again. So for the shoe to be on the other foot is quite interesting. I'll speak for you, Connor, and say keep Bally Mumba. A very, very interesting one. And again, this idea of generating funds for transfers and keeping your head above water wherever you want to put those funds. Andrew Omobamidele. Connor, I want you to lead with this one, because isn't he been linked with a move away to AC Milan, another European giant for a Norwich City youngster? But just quickly, what was it? £20 million was the touted figure. I wouldn't pay that for Andrew Omobamidele. He's been injured quite a lot in his time. He's shown promise, but in this back line, I think he's been perhaps not as guilty, but I don't think he's been much better than Grant Hanley and Ben Gibson. And of course, we'll speak about those players. But where do you sit on that?
I can see why a lot of clubs would be interested in him, because I think he's got all of the attributes of a modern centre back, and that's clear to see. He's big, he's physical, he can play. I think the best thing that I like about him is his ability to defend the space behind him. I don't think there's a lot of defenders at this level that you can see defend the space as well behind him as he does. That being said, I totally take on board what you said. I don't think the performances have been quite where he would like, but by the same token, particularly in the latter part of the season, a lot of those performances have come alongside someone who isn't a centre back and come in a young back four. So I think what we've maybe learned is that he needs some experience alongside him. I'm not surprised by the links at all. I think I see him as someone that clubs would look at and be very attracted to, and essentially what you're paying for there is potential. And I think he's got a very, very high ceiling. Only just 20, I think, so still incredibly young, still incredibly capable. And yeah, I think if there was room there and and someone paid the fee that is being reported, then Norwich would have to accept it. Because that's the sort of money they're not in a position to turn down. And equally, you know, it's a similar sort of fee that they would have got, or maybe slightly under it, but than what they got for Ben Godfrey a few years ago. So I can see why there's an attraction there. I think there's probably a need for Norwich to refresh that area of the pitch. They've not signed anyone there permanently since Ben Gibson a couple of summers ago. They've had a few loanees. They've had a lot of injuries in that area, Omobamidele included. I think there probably is a need for that part of the pitch, in my view, just to get a few fresh faces in and a bit more depth than what we've seen. And also, he's probably one of the, and I know I mentioned this earlier in terms of assets, but I think he is one of the players that other clubs would deem as an asset. I think he's one of the players that other clubs would be willing to pay a pretty decent fee for because of all the reasons that I spoke about. So ultimately, whether or not Norwich want to keep him might become quite irrelevant quite quickly, given how much they want to change and churn the squad. So he's a really interesting one because I think in an ideal world, you'd want him to have a full season and you'd want to see how his development kind of blossomed. But in reality, I think it's going to be pretty unlikely that he's a Norwich City player come the start of the season.
Ben, for you, Big Andy, is he? I guess maybe Connor's said a lot there in terms of if people will pay for him, sell, bring in perhaps a couple of extra bodies rather than just sticking with one man. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think Connor made all the key points. He made one earlier as well, in that people pay more for centre halves than they do for fullbacks. So when I'm looking at the assets, you kind of think, well, the two South American lads, you want to develop them a little bit more. Don't want to, there's probably a higher ceiling to make money there. Aaron's, Premier League clubs might try and lowball because he's been around for a while and he's small or whatever, and there's only a year left on the contract. And then I agree about Gunners as well. Is that going to be one where someone comes in with a big bid? I would suggest this is the one, Omobamidele, that you might get the biggest bid for. And then, we all have ideas of, I'd like to sell this player for this much. And Norwich are actually very good at that because we spoke about the Fab Five and they sold Ben Godfrey, didn't they? And raised the money that they would need to without selling any of those guys, and that was very smart. But maybe they're in less of a good bargaining position now, and maybe he's the one that people might want to pinch. Young, big, physical, international centre back. So yeah, that might be an exit, and Norwich might not get 100% what they want in terms of that regard. Hopefully they do for your guys' sake, but you could see it playing out that way.
Let's say then transfer fee is what we would deem appropriate. We won't talk about figures, but I think let's say sell then, because in terms of allocation of funds and growing the squad as a whole, as we know, as Norwich tried to do with Buendia, rather than doing everything you can to keep one man, perhaps it's better to just say goodbye, take that money and try and rebuild.
Yeah, I don't think they'd be 100% happy with that either. I think if you caught them honestly, I think they'd say actually we'd have preferred to keep him for a year. We'd prefer to try and get that value up a little bit higher. But you're right, it will come down to kind of the greater good, I suppose, and whether they'll get more from selling him in terms of improving their squad and the funds that would bring, rather than keeping him in the side. And I think there's also an element as well that you have to be kind of careful with young players, particularly when you have a model like Norwich's, because if a club comes in and is willing to pay a decent fee, if you obstruct that, there are younger players further down the squad and into your academy as well, who will be acutely aware of that pretty quickly, and then they can be left unsettled if, okay, it's all very well and good the pathway being there, but you've also got to show that there's an opportunity to further your career. So I think it's a really interesting one, but I think your kind of conclusion is the right one. And it's interesting because I think I'd view it almost as a sacrifice that Norwich would have to make, and I don't think they're going to be 100% happy with it, but it might well allow them to do a bit more with the squad, which is ultimately probably what everyone wants and probably what they need to do as well.
Just jump in. I did an interview with Kieran Dyer, who was in this position at Ipswich in the late 90s. He was the one that they sold, and he kind of answered. He said, "Was Gary Croft, John McGreal, Jermaine Wright, and Marcus Stewart. Marcus Stewart less, but were they better players than me? No. But would I beat them in a 4-on-1 game? No. The team was better as a result, and sometimes it's the way, isn't it?
Yeah, as Norwich fans, especially with, again, and I know there are various comments to be made on the self-sustaining model. You have to think about these things more than perhaps some other clubs would. There are a couple of names that I do want to tick off the list where a discussion can't really be had. So I want to keep loan or sell. Sam McCallum, decent Championship left back, very young. For me, it's a keep because I think he knows that he's not going to be this pivotal starter, but he also, from what I've seen and what I believe, he has that ability to make himself that. Whether he will or won't, I don't know, but I do think he has that ability. So for Norwich, Sam McCallum is that keep, loan, sell.
Yeah, I would agree with you. It's really interesting how this one has panned out because I remember a lot of people speaking about Sam McCallum the same way they're speaking about Barley Mumba, although slightly different achievements. But he did it in a fairly good side. That QPR team last year was pretty decent by Championship standards. And obviously
Coventry side as well. He played in Connor as well.
Absolutely. So in terms of Barley Mumba, far more Championship know-how and experience and appearances. I think you'd be willing to give him another year at the very least to kind of see what he can develop into. I'd be lying and if I sat here and said I didn't want to see a bit more from him than I have, but I think he's obviously injuries have played a part in that, and it's quite a fierce left back battle that Norwich have got at the moment. I don't think there's too much between the two, but I think Giannoulis probably does just edge it. So yeah, and then of course we have the Mumba dimension as well, which is he a right back? Is he a left back? Where does David Wagner view him? I suspect it will be as a right back, given the holes they've got in the squad. But if that's the left back, then you're going to have to make room for him somehow. And it's going to be interesting if that is the conclusion reached, exactly how they do that. But yeah, Sam McCallum, I'd like to see him given another year because I think there's a player in there. And I think with the best is probably yet to come from him, in my view.
Ben, Dimitris Giannoulis, and we'll move on to him quickly just because I completely agree with Connor in this idea that they're very similar in terms of ability. I think the idea is generally that Giannoulis is meant to be this more sort of driving forward fullback, whereas Sam McCallum is maybe a little bit more sensible on the back foot. It's very close. It really is sort of minute differences, but Giannoulis for you and McCallum, the difference for you, but also keep loan sell. Where do you sit?
I think sometimes you just have to protect your balance sheet as well. And I think Giannoulis was quite expensive, wasn't he? So I think there's a certain amount of protecting of asset and getting as much out of it as you can. I like McCallum, and I know the QPR fans and the Coventry fans did. And can play both sides as well. And you need four fullbacks. So if it's I assume, as you have been, that it's a sensible wage that Giannoulis is on. So, yeah, I think I agree with what you've suggested. Yeah.
Sweet. For wages, we can only speculate.
Of
wages
course,
is such it's such a scary thing in football, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because sometimes you can believe one thing and out of nowhere, bang.
I think the evidence, though, to give Norwich credit, is when we do get the numbers. I know they're always a year out, and you're always guessing a little bit. They're normally sensible, aren't they?
Yeah, I think, well, that's Norwich's model, isn't it? This idea of sensible finances. How true that is, we don't know. We can only speculate. An interesting player before we get on to two that, Ben, I'm really keen to pick your brains on, is Jonathan Tompkinson. He's just been promoted from League Two with Stevenage. Didn't play
Steve Evans
many
loves
games.
Norwich, doesn't he?
Yeah, he really does, and long may it rain for as long as he perhaps produces good players for Norwich. Jonathan Tompkinson, Ben, from your point of view, I don't really know anything about him from his very short spell at Stevenage, but I think I've seen him in a couple of games for Norwich. One was in the Cup, Connor. Is that right? Against Birmingham, and he looked way out of his depth, out of his depth. But then he played away against Burnley, and it was like a completely different player. When he played against Burnley, it was essentially his performance is what you would describe as an ideal centre-back for Norwich, where on the ball he was calm, very sensible in terms of making sort of decisions when it came to duels, whereas against Birmingham it was the complete opposite. From your point of view, Jonathan Tompkinson, is he a player that you were really aware of? Because again, he seems to be quite under the radar.
Yeah, I think he's a really. I actually felt he was quite hard done by because, like you, I came away from that Burnley game thinking that was pretty. I mean, it wasn't spectacular, and I wasn't uber excited for it, but I definitely felt we should have seen a little bit more from him of him after that. Sorry, I would say that the interesting element of that is he was playing alongside Grant Hanley rather than perhaps what centre backs have had to endure since his injury, which has not been the case. And I think his experience. I spoke about it earlier on, but you can still get value from players. And in terms of those young players, and this is what Norwich did so well in a couple of years ago with their title win, creating a structure that allows those young players to flourish and to make mistakes and to feel comfortable. And I think it's a common theme over Grant Hanley's time at Norwich that actually his partnerships have been pretty good because he's kind of helped players and brought them up to his level. So that was kind of my reading from that night. It's been interesting kind of watching him go to Stevenage and not play too much. I think I was probably expecting him to be a little bit more involved than he has been. There's obviously reasons for that. I know they had a lot of goalkeeper injuries and
Had 7 different keepers during the season.
Yeah,
I
which
think
is
2 of them were from Norwich as well, weren't they?
Yeah, which is incredible. I think he was involved in a run of games where they had a little bit of a wobble as well, by all accounts. And Steve Evans turned back to experience, and from there was pretty hard to get into the side. But in many ways, that first loan experience isn't always about playing games. It's about the experience of it and not getting into the team, and sometimes the frustrations as well. So I think this year might come too soon from him. That's kind of my feeling at this moment in time. But if they could get him into League One and get him playing regularly, I think that would be a good test. And then you could basically take a view in January as to what you wanted to do from there. But I like him as a player. I've watched him a few times in different age groups, and I've always been quite struck with him for the same reasons as Andrew Bamadelli, really. I think he's got really good attributes. It's just a case about whether they translate to the senior game or not. But I think for next season, for what Norwich City want, I think he's probably not quite where they would need him to be for him to be involved. But I could be wrong.
Are we happy for a universal loan then?
We could go back to Stevenage, and the thing I was going to add was I know people are. We all laughed literally as soon as I mentioned Steve Evans, and I know people get very snotty about direct football. Let's be frank, a long ball team just got promoted. There's many ways to skin a cat. I love a bit of tactical diversity. He is going to have learned so much. Yeah. Carl Piagiani, this 6'5" unit who heads bricks, and the way Stevenage play, literally squeeze, head it, kick it. What a brilliant education. Not going to want Norwich to be playing like that in the Championship, but I think it's really, really helpful when these guys do go into, you get in trouble for saying, go play men's football for a year in League Two or whatever. But I think it's a brilliant sort of learning experience.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And 2 players, and Connor, off camera, on camera, whatever, we have spoken about these players for hours. Ben Gibson, Grant Hanley. Ben, I'm going to turn to you, and you are, right, a Championship guru, and I think these 2 players define the Championship. Or maybe not define the Championship, maybe that's a bit strong. But from the outside, as perhaps Norwich fans that aren't particularly favourable towards them as we once were, Grant Hanley, Ben Gibson, what are your thoughts? Because I can imagine from your point of view, maybe it's, well, these guys have been there and done it in the Championship. They have to be a part of it. Is that very much your sort of ethos towards them?
Oh, it's so hard to say because there's a scenario where they're retained and it doesn't work at all, and it was a really bad idea. And there's a scenario where they're shipped out and it doesn't go well, and everyone says you can't get rid of all of that quality. And not that this is the defining part of the argument, but a lot of other Championship clubs would really love to have one or both of those guys. That doesn't win or lose the argument. And then you see someone like Sean Morrison, who's been everywhere, and he goes into Rotherham, and all of a sudden they improve. People like Richard Keogh, who played 100 years in the Championship. So I think it goes back to what Connor was saying about Tim Krul. It's perhaps not both of them being retained, because I'm sure, and rightly so, I'm sure they're well paid as well. But it's what that looks like when they are retained. It's, is it one of them with Bamadelli who's fit all season and you're like, happy days, you know? Or is it not going to play Saturday, Tuesday, which is hard to do with centre half. So I'm very, very split. I can see the arguments for both, and I would defer to your knowledge on the prevailing mood, but it's very hard. You can't buy hundreds of games of experience and championship knowledge and that chaperone deal that they can just walk other players through a game. So I would defer to your knowledge and say you can see arguments for and against, but I would suggest not both of them staying. But I'll let you answer. With a bit more of a smarter view than me on what that looks like.
I think in terms of, for me, Colin, before I come to you, I always lean towards Grant Hanley as sort of my preference. I don't necessarily think during that sort of first Ben Gibson season, on the ball, very progressive, and I think he continues to try to be, but the system in his first season compared to the system in his second season, so Daniel Farke's sacking that season, the difference between those two seasons for me was, in the Championship, it was all about keeping it on the floor, retaining possession. How can we sort of cut our way through a team's defense? Whereas, and it was interesting because Christoph Zimmermann did an interview where he basically said we were being told to play kick and rush. To go from that as Ben Gibson, where you have all these impressive passing stats, to then the second season where actually Premier League teams are pressing a lot more intensity because the sort of the dynamic of Norwich and how they're viewed shifts completely, to having players who are quite static. He then has to just launch the ball, and all of a sudden those really pretty and quite attractive stats don't look as nice. So I think in terms of Ben Gibson, that's where I feel a little bit sorry for him. But Grant Hanley, for you, Connor, is he your preference?
Yeah, I think so. I still sit here and feel he's Norwich's best defender, and I mean that purely in kind of the rawest sense of the word. Tackles, blocks, heads, all of those. If you're going to put your money on one of them, I think you'd be putting your money on Grant Hanley. I mean, the only unknown with him is obviously the injury that he sustained, that Achilles injury, and Louis Thompson is the best example from Norwich City perspective. But there's quite a few other players, and I've spoken to a few people as well who feel that after an injury like that, you can only come back to maximum of 85% of what you were before, and he's at an age where that is probably not going to be great. Obviously, he's come back from injuries before, and he's been a really important player before, club captain as well by all accounts, and really important for the culture of the place. And then Ben Gibson, who's a very different defender, and certainly at points during his time at Norwich City has been their best progressive passer. And like you say, was so influential to what Daniel Farke was trying to achieve in his style of play. So two very, very different defenders. But my view, as I said earlier, is that this is an area of the pitch that just needs a bit of a shake-up, I think, and needs a couple of new additions. So by nature of that, I think Ben's right. I think you probably do have to lose one. I wouldn't want to lose them both because of the experience that they gain. That being said, if they were both kept around and they added to, I don't think you could really argue with that either. Because I think you've seen what a Norwich back four looks like without them in recent weeks, about both of them, that is. And they were a partnership as well in that second title winning season that had a really good defensive record actually in the Championship, and that's interesting as well from that point, and whether David Wagner's taken anything from that. But you're right, Ben Gibson hasn't flourished in the same way since that season. He obviously has had injury problems of his own. So I would probably lean more towards Grant Hanley, purely because I think you'd probably get better money for Ben Gibson if I'm being honest. So yeah, that's probably where I am with those two. But again, I wouldn't be against both of them staying. Wouldn't particularly be against neither of them staying. I think you could create arguments for all of that. But where I am is that area of the pitch, which hasn't been shaken up in a good few years, does need some new bodies added to it, I think, and new ideas and fresh competition, I think, because it feels like a part of the pitch that's gone stale, but is also quite unreliable because of the fitness issues of the guys that we've spoken about already.
Okay, so I think the conclusion from that for me is perhaps, and this is for the sake of the gimmick of the title of the video, keep one of them, sell the other, and let's say maybe in our ideal world, the ideal world that within football does not exist. We perhaps lean towards Grant Hanley in terms of keeping, and I agree with what you say, Connor, in terms of the idea that Ben Gibson would probably maybe not warrant, but generate a bit more sort of funding for Norwich. Ben, we've talked about this point, haven't we? The Tim Krul idea of experience being vital. So this next player that I'm going to mention, Kenny McLean, I very much see him similar to Tim Krul. Maybe not so much in that I think he would contribute more to a Norwich City team, next season than what Tim Krul would. But this idea of keeping that invaluable experience around, and again, he's a player who Norwich haven't really paid a lot of money for. So it's not like we're having to go down the perhaps Janulis route of we've paid £6-7 million for a player. We're trying to squeeze every last drip of value out of him. With Kenny McLean from the outside, I feel like I keep saying from the outside, but
No, it's fine.
do you see him being perhaps a key part of Norwich's season? He got, you have to correct on a third or second place in the Player of the Season awards voted for
Second,
by the fans. Second place. So inside the club, he seems to be valued. From the outside, a key player.
Well, he's just very trustworthy, isn't he? I think I've seen him play left back for you. I think I went and did a game and he played fullback. I've seen him play, as an attacking, number 8. I've seen him play box to box. I've seen him play as a holding midfielder. Was he ever the technical whiz even in the most successful teams? No, but good runner, good ball carrier, decent shot on him. Left footer, right, as well.
Mm-hmm.
Very, very useful guy to have around. So again, if it's not too expensive to keep, and again, don't build your team around him, and it sounds patronising to somebody who's obviously very good at football, but it's one you kind of want to keep around, utilise and build around the South American chats.
Yeah, Connor, for me, Kenny McLean, and this is where I sit, he's a player who really frustrates me, but it's because he will switch between being outstanding to just an absolute buffoon on the football pitch. There is the odd middle grade performance where you don't notice him, and perhaps sometimes that's what you want from a central midfielder. But the thing with McLean is, and he must sort of just inject Red Bull into his veins before every game, because he is he's a little terrier on the pitch, isn't he? And to say that he's a little terrier, but for him to be quite normal sized is kind of weird. But there's been performances where he is outstanding, where he technically is very good. The passing range, especially the diagonal pass across the pitch, which typically would find someone like Max Aarons. When he's on it, which is why I find him so frustrating. For you, is that worth perhaps keeping him around?
Yeah, I'd keep it. I keep him around. I think for all of the qualities that you guys have spoken about, I think he's one of the players that showed a real level of improvement under David Wagner in the early stages of his managerial time here. He got dropped into that back three, didn't he? As they build up, and
did he play centre back as well?
Well, it was more kind of an in possession role. He'd Norwich drop back and create kind of a defensive free, and it'd almost be a bit sort of really key to their build up, and he kind of flourished in that role in the early part of his time. But I view him, I think David Wagner views him in the same way he viewed Jonathan Hogg at Huddersfield, just someone who was dependable, reliable, someone that he could construct a side around really, and someone who would provide a degree of continuity in amongst that. And it was interesting kind of speaking to Gabby Sarah at various points of this season, and he would be very keen to point out that he's been able to do what he's done because Kenny McLean was alongside him. And I think that's a really interesting element to it. And David Wagner likes him by all accounts. Would I like to see him start every game? If I'm honest, probably not. But again, I think you have to have these kind of players who, again, are less in there because of the brilliance that they bring, and more for the structure and what they can allow other players to do. And I feel he's one of those. He's an enabler. And if Norwich can get the right talent and right balance to their midfield, I think you would see very quickly Kenny McLean become quite a major part of that. And I think also a big ticker, but next to his name really, is that Norwich have had 3 head coaches since he's been at the club: Daniel Farker, Dean Smith and David Wagner. Whatever you think of those coaches, all of them have viewed him as absolutely instrumental to what they want to do. And for where Norwich are right now, which is the Championship, I still think people view stuff through a Premier League lens, and I understand that totally. but he is more than capable at this level of being a consistent performer. So yeah, one that I would keep, one that I would probably be looking to, or also you'd want, I think, a player by the end of the season to have surpassed him. But certainly for those early stages of the season, I think he could be a really important cog for what Norwich are trying to do, just in terms of pure stability more than anything else.
Whenever you say hog, I just want to yell out Dini, and we're recording
10
today.
years, yeah.
10-year anniversary. Go ahead,
Yeah.
Ben. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's just as a fan of football, it's a nice thing to remember. And I
What a
genuinely,
goal.
yeah, genuinely, as you said, Hulk, there in my mind, I just went, Dini! Oh, what a beautiful, beautiful memory. A player that I don't think we really need to speak about, and let's say keep for Kenny McLean, is Jakob Sorensen. For me, he is a very important part of this idea of depth, and one of Norwich's key strengths, especially for the last title-winning campaign, was this idea of depth, and the 5-sub rule was implemented, and it almost seemed unfair at times that Norwich was sort of bringing on these players at like 70, 75 minutes. Mario Vrancic was a great example. How, for me at the time, a Premier League quality midfielder, Norwich could just whip in as a third or fourth choice midfielder. For me, Sorensen won't have that same effect, but is a very important part of that. He can play left back. He can try and play centre back. He can play in centre mid. Again, it's been a bit unfair on him during his time at Norwich, where he's not been able to play in his natural position, whatever that may be, whether it's the number 8, whether it's the number 6. But Blackburn away was a key example of when he plays in midfield, his passes can be pretty important. I'll let you guys decide amongst yourselves. Do you have anything to add about Sorensen other than just a very good squad option? Good age as well.
I would have liked to have seen more of him at this point, if I'm being honest. More from him, sorry. And you're right, the mitigation hasn't been there. But even when he's played in midfield, I don't think we've seen the consistency that you'd want to see at this point of his Norwich career. And you're right, I think it's hard on him because every time he seems to break into that role, he seems to be plucked out of it to fill another hole somewhere. And I think it's very difficult for players to flourish in multiple positions at different points. Even when he was at left back, Norwich still felt they needed another left back to come in and improve their squad, So my fear for him is that he's never going to quite be able to be a frontline option. And is that the point where you just kind of say a player isn't good enough? I don't know. Maybe that's the debate. I would keep him personally for the reasons that you've said, and for the reason that you can't get rid of everybody. But as I said with I can't remember who I said it with earlier, but Sam McCallum, I think I'd want to see significant levels of improvement in the next year and proof that he's capable of being a more established part of this Norwich City team than perhaps he's shown so far.
I know he's not positionally, well, nowhere near the exact same as him, but I feel like from what you've said there, in terms of the priority of his development at Norwich, I think you're completely right. You'd expect to see more from him just as a player at Norwich City. But for example, I think if you had to choose between, for example, Liam Gibbs, a Norwich City sort of, not completely, as we know, youth product, but this idea of a young player making his way up at Norwich City, you choose him, quite a raw talent, or someone who is kind of established as a Norwich City player, not as a Norwich City midfielder or defender. I think you're going to choose the Liam Gibbs option, aren't you? Would you agree with that, Ben? This idea that perhaps maybe his time will be up fairly soon.
Yeah, I don't. It's not my style to be mean to anybody, but I'm not seeing it really. I think sometimes it's an exotic sign in from a different country, and you expect it to. Oh, is this going to be the next insert name here? And is he a left back? Is he a central midfielder? Is he a centre back? Has he? I don't think it will be one that you'll be building a team around. And with that being said, as politely as I can, I would be thinking about a sort of Scandinavian European offer being one, but that could be completely unfair. But it's my take.
Yeah, I mean, I'm with Ben really. I mean, to kind of be sat here, when was he signed? 2020, so 3 years ago, and to kind of still be wondering exactly what he is and what he can offer on a consistent basis. I think that's very hard to form an argument to say that he's someone that you should probably be looking to keep at the club. So, what I hope is that he doesn't just get kind of kept because he's useful in quite a few positions. I don't think that's really good for him, and I don't think he's particularly good for Norwich either.
Yeah, that's totally fair enough. Liam Gibbs, let's just say keep for time's sake, a really good player. Ben, former Ipswich player, now Norwich City player. How do you sort of quickly look at his development?
I think Liam Gibbs sums up everything that was wrong with the previous ownership at Ipswich, when we are led to understand that the loophole that Norwich were perfectly, within their rights to accept, was literally administrative, and he basically didn't get offered the deal at the time he should have, and it was like, which is just absurd, and they frankly deserve everything they get if he goes on to be a great player. Now, fortunately, we hope that there's a little more in the way of organisation there, and I know we get a lot of juvenile back and forth, but at that point, with the state of the two clubs, I think most people would have done what he did. And I did the Norwich Millwall game way back August, and I fairly friendly with Billy Mitchell as well. They were both playing in central midfield, and really held his own. And I know he's gone a bit further forward as well, but yes, keep, and yes, after the sting and the frustration and just the farce of how it happened, and a promotion a couple of years later helps soften it as well. But I'm kind of at peace with it now, but it's ridiculous.
Yeah, a cracking player, a really
excellent,
good player. Again, he'll need a lot of refining, but the evidence is there that he is very self-aware and should develop into. I still don't know sort of how attacking or defensive he'll be, but I'm excited to find out. It's not like with Sorensen.
He'll be whatever the manager he's working with needs. I think it'll be one of those, won't it?
Well, there you go, and that's compliments to Liam Gibbs for being a good footballer. Norwich's two South American assets, that buzzword again, assets.
Whoa.
Marcelino Nunez and Gabriel Sara. Ben, I'm going to come to you for Sara, and I'll come to you, Connor, for Nunez, because they came into Norwich basically unknown. I think Nunez more unknown than Sara, but Gabby Sara has been a real revelation. And Ben, as someone who doesn't watch Norwich week in, week out, I get the feeling that perhaps your opinion on Gabby Sara will be a lot higher. And that's not to say that, for example, my opinion isn't very high of him, but I think it would be a lot more higher than perhaps mine would, just because we see the imperfections of his performances. Whereas, I mean, he's kind of a viral monster, isn't he, for just scoring really good goals? A bit like a former Argentinian player that we used to have.
Yeah, who did it 3 times per game as opposed to once every month. But no, you just got to love it, haven't you? South Americans in expensive fees, flamboyant flair, and if you're going to get another trend up under Stuart Webber, it's those key. And I think we think the thick end of 10 million quid was laid down as well, don't we? Not knowing the exact numbers, but yeah, that's someone you've got to build the team around, give the ball a lot, indulge a bit, help develop, and you would hope. I mean, look, you struck not even gold, platinum, whatever with Buendia, but anywhere near, and you'll have a massive asset. So it's a massive thumbs up, massive keep, and I've loved a couple of was it away at Millwall, the one?
Absolute scorcher. Yeah.
Love it. Absolutely love it. Keep.
Yeah, love that. Nunez for you, Connor. Really blow hot. I say I blow hot and cold. I don't think I like Nunez. I'm going to be honest. I mean, he scores, again, the odd screamer, and annoyingly, I actually.
How was that not the EFL goal of the season as well? That volley.
Do you know what? I'm so fine with it on the basis of where I sit at Carrow Road. I should have had the perfect view, but I was in a car on the way back from Scotland, so I could only watch it on my phone. I was absolutely gutted. But Nunez for you, I'm not really a fan in the fact that I don't know what he's particularly brilliant at. He kind of came in as this little ticker, but then his passes kept going astray, and he's not quick. He's not defensive. What is Nunez, Connor? What is he?
It's a good question. I like you. I can see 2 situations for Marcelino Nunez. I can see him becoming brilliant and becoming integral because I think technically he's very, very good. I don't see him. The problem is I'm not really sure he fits into a Wagner side, and that's maybe the
Mhm.
issue I have with him. I think
Exactly that. Yeah.
he's one that you'd be looking at as if we were talking about a Daniel Farke Norwich City side. I think you'd be looking at him and go, oh yeah, okay, I can see it. But with Wagner, I'm not quite sure where exactly he fits. That being said, I think there's a few things that you have to take with him. Obviously, the upheaval of moving to a different continent at an incredibly young age, which is something that both him and Gabby Sarah have had to do. Different people respond to that differently. He still doesn't know English. Gabby Sarah does. So I think there's perhaps elements as to why he's not quite adapted in the way that maybe Gabby Sarah has. He's also been playing football pretty consistently since I think last February. So because of the way the Chilean season works, he's not really had a break since then. So I think that could also be a contributing factor as to why we saw him start quite well and then kind of fizzle out. They kind of went in opposite directions, didn't they? Sarah started pretty slowly and then took off, and Nunez started pretty quickly and then kind of faded. So I think with him, he's one I'm reserving judgment on until after the summer. If we're still in this situation where he's struggling to affect games and we're seeing flashes, I think we would probably be having a different conversation about whether to keep him or not. But I think he is one where if they could find a role for him and they can get him firing in a David Wagner side, I think he could look very good pretty quickly. That being said, I could see the complete opposite of that. So I think what I'm saying is I think it's a little bit wait and see with him. But I like him as a player, and I think that there is that potential for it to click and go. That being said, if you really pushed me on it, I don't really see that happening at this moment in time. But he's definitely one that I think he deserves a second season and deserves a little bit of time to try and make it work here.
Cool. Let's say keep for that. In terms of the midfield, I was kind of expecting a resounding keep for most of them, but it's been an interesting sort of little chat about them there. Wingers is next. Wingers are next. Wingers is next. Goodness me, it's that time of the pod.
If only we had a professional journalist with us to help you out. Hey?
Well, exactly.
Hello.
Well, yeah, where is he? With Wingers and Norwich, what I want to do is I want to group a couple of them together. So, for example, Tony Springett, John Rowe, immediate loans for me. I'm going to say let's just move on from those. If anyone disagrees, surely they've got to go out on loan. Tony Springett.
The only thing I would add is that we know that David Wagner has been told that he will really like John Rowe. So I think there's potential for him to still be around. But I would probably.
Did Rowe go out on loan?
No,
No, he's spent quite a lot of this season injured.
Springett was with
Derby.
Derby, yeah.
Yeah, it's I don't know. I kind of look at those two, and for me, I've not seen anything to get excited about. Go and smash it in League One or lower in the Championship,
the thing for me around Rowe is, for as much excitement as there's been around him, he's yet to start a game for Norwich. So
yeah, I don't know if I believe the excitement though, Connor, with John Rowe. You know, I know he came around at a time where it was really just embarrassing for Norwich in the Premier League. So I think we were perhaps looking for any sort of crumbs to latch onto. But for me, sitting there watching a game of football, looking at this young footballer who people are chanting for, I don't know. I was never really sold.
Yeah, I think I've spoken to a lot of people who have worked with him previously and who are working with him now and feel that he's always been the best talent at every age group that he's played at Norwich City, and I think there's been a lot of work at keeping him in the system by all accounts. So I think there is excitement generally at what he can provide, but you're right. I think I probably haven't quite seen enough from him yet, and that's probably why, to be fair, Dean Smith never gave him a start, and why David Wagner's yet to give him a start. So I think he's going to be one where you'd probably say he's got it all to play for really in pre-season. He's probably got an opportunity there to grab it if he wants to grab it. By the same token, I wouldn't say there's huge amounts of pressure on him to do that because, like you, I actually think a loan away could be quite beneficial for him on the pitch and probably off the pitch as well.
Yeah. For the sake of name ticking, Milot Rashica is going to be a sale, isn't he? I'd forgotten about him completely. I've forgotten whilst he was still here. Really, just in my opinion, not good at all.
Your money people haven't forgotten about him.
Well, yeah, exactly. I guess that's pretty quite damning for them, isn't it? But I know you said, Ben, you don't like being mean about players. No, I don't mean to be mean, but he is. Just really not very good. And again, Norwich spent a good hefty fee on him, which I don't think there's any value to squeeze out there. And he wants to stay in Turkey. Is that right, Connor? And Galatasaray want him, and it's all about just agreeing a fee. This idea that they've offered 7 million euros, for me, that's a snatch and run and try and yeah. Okay, cool. That works for me. Before we get on to well, let's say Onel Hernandez, it's got to be a keep, just signed a new contract. Ben, I've got a question for you. This idea that Norwich are giving Onel Hernandez a new contract, what do you make of that? Because he's been a pivotal player for Norwich before, and we keep talking about this idea of Norwich going in a slightly new direction with a new manager, a different system, yet returning to Onel Hernandez again after he's been away from the club for a period of time. What do you sort of make of all of that?
I mean, your default position goes. Where did he get loaned out to? Birmingham and Borough?
Birmingham,
Yep.
Yeah. Your immediate default position is. I think you're being kind with pivotal. By the way, I think he was a useful pair of legs in a absolutely brilliant team. I hope I'm not underselling his. But it was the other side of the pitch that was the one.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
guys there, wasn't it? So useful rather than pivotal. But I'm being pedantic here. No, your instinct is to immediately go, look, if it wasn't going to work. But I just clicked and looked, it's 25 as well. So you've got smart people in the club there to put that contract down and offer it. But I don't know.
Is in Onel Hernandez is 25?
Yeah, is that right?
No, he's shirt number 25. I think he's 30.
My God. That's embarrassing. He's
Still
not
a long
25. He wears shirt number.
I thought I was hearing that then. I was like,
sorry.
Oh God, is he?
Oh, sorry. Oh well, God, I stand corrected then. The point I was going to make is that's a useful age. You're a 30-year-old. Yeah.
If he was 25, mate, I'd be buzzing. I'd be so
fair.
buzzing.
Yeah, fair. Sorry. I'm sure I'll get buried in the comments for that. Is it a bit like when your mate, gets back with his girlfriend and you're like, why has he done that? Is that going to work? I don't know. You guys will say better than me, but with the 2023, 24 season, are you relying on the brilliant? Love watching him because just box office, knock it 20 meters ahead of you and just blister everybody. But yeah, he's got the contract, and that's how I feel about it.
Yeah, I think, Connor, you mentioned the word sort of continuity earlier. Perhaps that's what we can latch onto. And you say we'll know more, but the way you've summed that up there with that little analogy, I think that's absolutely perfect. And I can now imagine watching a Pinkham podcast where Connor claims that as his own and doesn't give any credit.
It's yours.
It's
yours. Have it.
I would never.
I'm very much look forward to that. In terms of other dodgy wingers, Shemitov Poeta.
He's gone from pivotal to dodgy in the space of 3
minutes.
Yeah.
Well, yes, I'm a Norwich City fan, Ben. I
fickle.
From it's exactly what I am, and do you know what? I'm not going to change. I'm not going to change. Poeta, sell. If I don't know who would buy Poeta because he had that spell at Birmingham, didn't he? Which again, quite brief. Didn't really play. I think he kind of fits less so into the Hernandez mold of pace and trying to take players on. It's just he doesn't take
wing
players
back
on.
for Birmingham. I saw him play left wing back right at the start of the season. So completely different.
Explain why that didn't go very well then. Sell for me, it's a sell. Yeah, cool. Yeah, it works for me. Right now, a player where for both of you, I'm keen to pick your brains. I've been quite extreme with some opinions here, and I'm going to maintain that theme.
That's a shock.
Christos Scholis. For me, sell if anyone will pay anything for him. I know he's a young player and he's been here for 2 years and it's been very disrupted. But again, spent a lot of money on him. I know it's not his fault, but I don't see any. I can't identify what he is because when a winger isn't particularly quick, he's not slow, but he's not quick. You kind of think, right, maybe it's the Buendia mold of they'll be more aggressive on the ball. They'll look to drift inside rather than use pace sort of out wide. He doesn't quite seem to do that. Every time he's on the ball, it's usually either a fairly flaccid shot or a pass back. And I just don't know where you go from there with Scholis, especially with this idea of and this is where I'm heavily influenced by David Wagner and this idea of wingers being really important for him. And I don't know if I can depend on him. Connor, Scholis, please give me hope.
Yeah, I think there's a player in there. I wonder if he is a winger, to be honest. I could see him either getting moved into an inside role as a 10, or someone trying him as a striker, which I think is probably less likely to succeed. But I think I've just got in my head, because of the way he is. He's quite bulky and like a muscular sense, body frame sense, not in the way that me and you are bulky or whatever. But I think there
Don't
is
bring
a
me down into that, blimey.
I think there is an intelligence there, and I think there is a technicality there. He played a wonderful pass at West Brom, and actually that's the best I've seen him play for a little while. I'm not sure that he's 100% where they would like him to be from a fitness perspective. He's obviously come back from a knee injury that's kind of been his first serious injury that he's had in his career. So again, I mean, probably one that I'm looking at towards pre-season and going, there's a massive opportunity for you there. I would be inclined to give him another year, because I think he's at that age where if it didn't go particularly well, I still think there's value to be had. Not the value that Norwich City paid for him, but they would be able to get money for him. So I think he's one that you would just want to take another year on to fully assess, because I think, again, if they could find a role for him and if he could find some confidence as well, because I get the sense he's a massive confidence player, which all players are confidence players. I don't like using those cliches really, but he seems like someone who does kind of need his a coach to tell him how great he is, and an arm around the shoulder and whatnot. And I feel if he gets that, he could launch pretty rapidly. So yeah, I would hold on to him with a view to probably making the decision and having the conversation that we're having at the moment probably next summer. So big preseason, big season for him. If he can't do it, then maybe even in January you'd look to make a decision on him. But for now, I think that there's enough there to make me just want to hold off a bit in terms of selling him.
Yeah, if David Wagner's going to go for that sort of 6 up front tactic that we've seen this season, where your fullbacks are your wingers and your wingers are coming inside, perhaps Scholes would fit that mould if you want to see him a bit more centrally. Anything to add, Ben, on Christos Scholes?
Just on what it stands for, if he is sold, because I know Stuart Webber's ego shouldn't come into the decision. She's made the right decision for the football club, for the betterment of it. But if they do end up bombing out Rasica and Jolis, I mean, you can say that's a show of strength to hold your hands up and go, look, that Premier League transfer window, I screwed that up royally. And you just wonder whether to prove the point that it wasn't a complete bust. Look, I've got to see this through now, and not that the director of football should be telling the sporting director, whatever title is at Norwich, should be telling the manager whom to play, but he's got a lot of skin in the game with that particular player in my kind of mind, and I don't know whether that comes into it at all.
I think realistically it's going to be a keep, isn't it? For the reasons of, as Connor says, age and there is still potential there. Of course, it's very naive of me to kind of dismiss him. And as you say, Ben, Stuart Webber, whether it's ego, whether it's anything like that, he spent a lot of money on that player, and he's going to want to basically have no choice but to either sell or sort of put his hands up and say he did wrong. Now, 3 players left, strikers. Adam Eder, Josh Sargent, and Abu Kamara. Let's start with Kamara, Connor. Ben, is it safe to say you perhaps don't really know anything about Abu Kamara? Yeah, there you go. So we'll go to Connor. Kamara for you, again, is it that Tompkinson spring it role of look, promising young player, very exciting, but really not near first team quality yet?
Yeah, I think he's probably slightly different though, because for the reasons that Ben talked about, Jonathan Tompkinson really, or that League Two loan being really beneficial for John Tompkinson. I think the idea of dropping Abu Kamara into League Two for me would be the opposite of that. I don't think it's what he needs at the moment. I think if Norwich could look to open up some of the Dutch avenues that they used in terms of Todd Cantwell and Dan Adshead and other players, they kind of dropped into that level, the ones who are a little bit more technical but maybe aren't quite physically where they need to be yet. I think that could be a good route for him in terms of experiencing first team football in a country where the football is very technical and very tactical and very intelligent. It's been kind of suggested to me a few times that he's a little bit of a late developer by all accounts, and he's a player who was a left back, and they've tried to convert into a striker. Now he's become an attacking midfielder. So I've always liked him when I've watched him play. I think there's definitely something there, but I think we've seen from the cameos off the bench that there's still a lot of rawness to what he's trying to do. So that would kind of be my blueprint for him, just to try and get him some football in Holland, even if that was until January, and then see how he kind of fared. And if that was relatively simple, and you felt like you wanted to drop him into a lower league in England, then I think that could make sense. But for here and now, I just fear that a loan to a League Two side where he's going to get kicked off the park every week, and not sure that's going to be particularly useful for his development at this stage. So that would kind of be the route that I'd go down with him.
In terms of his development and his age, he's only, as of just double checked, he's 19, he's 20 in July, so he's still
that's
very
not his
young.
shirt number.
Well, I did actually have to double check. You might have seen my panic there. Hang on a minute, he's 45 years old. No, but the thing with Kamara is, and I don't want to mention his name because he's not signed for Norwich yet, but Ashley Barnes. I think if we're looking at attacking players in terms of Kamara, to learn to be at Norwich, and if he stays here for a season and doesn't really do anything, that's fine, because he's young enough where that won't damage his career. To learn from someone such as Ashley Barnes, I think would be vital experience. And you say he's sort of perhaps dropped back to this attacking midfield role as opposed to perhaps a number 9. There are players in Norwich's squad, Gabby Sara, Kenny McLean, again, where there are traits from those players that sticking around for a season, being a part of the first team fold, coming off the bench 20 times in a season to score 2 or 3 goals would be really important experience.
Yeah, but again, it's about weighing up, I think, a player's individual development with the benefit of the team. I think he is one that I look at and think you will benefit from playing football at kind of a professional level and experiencing that. I think he shouldn't be playing 21s football now, and if he's not going to play 21s football, I think to get into a position where he's coming on for 10 minutes here and there, is that the best thing to improve him as a player in the long term? I'm not sure it is. I think you'd be more beneficial to make sure he was playing more regularly elsewhere, really. And I take your point. David Wagner only really likes to carry 3 strikers in his squad. He's told us that on numerous occasions. So I don't really see a spot for him in that regard. And I think by all accounts, Norwich will have a bigger squad next season as well. So I think he's one that I want to see more of. But I just feel for his development, we need to see more of in a different setting. I think that the most damaging thing for him at the moment is that he gets caught in that kind of Adam Eder role, that kind of halfway house between 21s and first team, where he's getting 10 minutes here and there. He's not getting enough time to impact it or to develop. And then you kind of get stuck with where Adam Eder is at this moment in time. So learn from that, be bold, send him out on loan.
What you've done there is you've stolen my segue to move on to Adam Eder and this idea of, and again, that term halfway house and being stuck is how I was going to move on to Eder. And Adam Eder, Ben, let's talk about him, because I feel like if we've ever spoken about him in a podcast before, and I think he definitely did come up in our sort of season review in that championship winning season, the point remains the same as it has done for the past 2 or 3 years with Adam Eder. This idea that if you write down his characteristics and you look at him as a person, he seems like the ideal footballer. Big, quick, quite likes to be on the ball. And I think that keyword powerful is the kind of forward that he is, yet keeps getting injured, isn't particularly prolific, especially under David Wagner. And this is where I have hope, this idea that we won't see him out wide on the wing again. Where do you sit with Adam Eder and this idea of, is he your main man, or perhaps the next player? We'll talk about Josh Sargent. Where do you sit with Adam Eder?
Oh, I'm far more in the Josh Sargent camp than in the Adam Eder camp. I remember, who did he play in the FA Cup? I think he scored a hat-trick.
Preston.
Yeah.
Preston. And I'm like, woof. There
Yeah.
you go. Look at this guy. You know, like you say, good size, strength, pace. It just hasn't happened, has it? And I think I'm kind of in the could you move on and try something else? Because what is it? Like, I know there's been injuries, okay, and yeah, you know, sometimes the most useful guy gets put out wide, doesn't he? But I think there's a point where you say, how many different managers have not wanted to, you know, get him starting and rely on him to the point where you think, that are all of those people wrong. So I don't know whether that might need a freshen up. And I would, given the choice between if it's one striker down the middle, I'd certainly be backing Sargent and selling Ida. You know, I'm sure he'll have a great career, but maybe that's just a timing thing.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. The thing with Ida as well is, as you say, with the manager thing, where they don't just chuck him in and have loads of faith in him. I'm kind of sat there. I can't remember the game. I mean, it's been multiple games where he's in a great position and he'll just balloon a shot. And it's kind of like you can only watch that so many times and sit there and go, oh, he'll create another chance. Oh, he'll develop as a footballer where he can put those away. It kind of gets to a point where, especially where you have Josh Sargent, I think he's only a little bit older. And this season, way more prolific. Of course, that form kind of dipped a little bit. But Ida, for me, it would have been how can we move him on if he hadn't just signed, what is it, Connor, a 5-year contract? His second 5-year contract?
It is. I mean, the only thing I would say is that I find the comparisons to Sargent a little bit unfair because Sargent's played a hell of a lot more football than Adam Ida has. You've got to remember that Adam Ida's been stuck behind Temu Pukki for 3 years. I mean, there's not many players who are going to get an awful lot of football in a Norwich City side that Temu Pukki is in. So even though he's 22, I think he started around about 18 or so games. So that's not a footballer that's played a lot of minutes at all in his professional career. Now this is kind of links to what I was talking about with Abu Kamara. He's kind of got a little bit stuck, and there were moments where for his own development he probably needed to go out on loan, but he hasn't been able to do that because Norwich have needed someone to support Temu Pukki, and finding a striker to do that has proven very difficult beyond Jordan Rhodes. So I have immense sympathy for him because I feel like he gets a lot more criticism than perhaps he deserves at points. And I can, again, I mean, the 5-year contract thing, he's taken a lot of stick for that, but it wasn't him who offered himself a 5-year deal. He just signed what was put in front of him. I think there's also been some suggestions that there's maybe not been the most professional attitude to things, and I think you could see that from Stuart Webber's quotes when that contract was announced. So I think they've ironed out some personality sort of side of it as well. But all I would say on Adam Ida is similarly to what I said on Andrew Almavamdeli. Really, I think he's got a lot of attributes that if he had a season where he scored 10 goals, he would become a very attractive commodity very, very quickly. And I think Norwich recognise that as well. And I don't think it would take an awful lot for that to happen. I think it is a case of a consistent run of games, maybe a coach who's willing to put a bit of time and confidence in him. I mean, David Wagner spoke about him in really glowing terms. Said he's worked with young players in Germany and rated Adam Ida as one of the best that he's worked with in terms of pure attributes and whatnot. So, I felt he's had it really tough because of the limited experience, because of the loan spells that he should have had that he didn't have. I feel it's a bit too late for that now. Really, I'd still like to see him kind of get out of the Norwich bubble and go and have half a season elsewhere and see if that helped it, because I think you'd learn a hell of a lot if you went on loan to another club in the Championship and really set the world alight. I think most people would view him very differently. I still remember when he had a couple of good games in the Premier League under Dean Smith, and everyone thought that he was going to be the answer to help Norwich stay in the Premier League. So football is a fickle game like that. I still think there's a player in there. Whether we see it or not might come down to circumstance, to coach, all different aspects. But I do feel a bit for Adam Ida.
Let's conclude with Josh Sargent then. Ben, you first. This idea of Josh Sargent in his first season at Norwich in the Premier League as basically a winger, where he'd been signed as a striker. It's what he was known for, being a striker, not a particularly prolific one, but as a Championship guru, to see him develop and at times really flourish in that number 9, perhaps more central role, where he has actually probably spent more time out wide. Do you rate Sargent?
I do, yeah. I'm a big fan. I mean, it helps that he seems to be a nice chap. There's money invested in, which we've mentioned a few times on the call, that is an important thing. You're building around those players, developing them. I had various Norwich friends telling me, look, obviously Pookie's a bit of a goat for you guys, and he wasn't ever going to, kind of usurp him sooner maybe than he's going to get the chance to do. But I would build around him, and even silly intangibles like if he's a United States international as well, just in terms of profile and value the sort of player you want to be put in front and center. And he's young as well, still, isn't he? So I would go all in on him. Actually, I like him a lot.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Sargent for obvious reasons, but also I do think he is a very, very good footballer. And the thing with him, what I find is that he's really quick. He's sort of surprisingly quick. Where he's clearly like just a proper athlete, as you can tell from the way he gets around the pitch. But off the mark, I do think he's very quick, and on the ball, I think he's really good. And I think his hold up play is really, really underrated. It's just. Whereas in the past, for example, Grant Holt being known for being a hold-up player for Norwich, where he's been able to give the ball to Wes Hoolahan or someone else, Sargent, when giving the ball, hasn't had particularly great options as a number 9. So perhaps that feature isn't as recognised, if you will. Sargent for you, Connor, to finish us off for the day until this time next year. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm probably not as hot on him as you two. I think he's okay. I think he's a good player. By no means, I don't want that to get misinterpreted as that I don't rate him or I don't think he's a good footballer. I do.
That will definitely happen, Connor.
It will definitely happen. But do I look at him and say, yep, there's the man who's going to step into Temu Pukki's shoes? Obviously in terms of impact, because that's impossible, I think. But in terms of importance to this Norwich City side, not hugely. If I'm being honest, I don't think he scores enough goals. I don't think he's a player that I think could. Again, I could look massively stupid, but I just don't feel that he is someone that I would put all my eggs in his basket. I also think he's someone that may well have suitors this summer, actually, in terms of all the reasons that we spoke about earlier, in terms of other players and Norwich perhaps not being able to decide who their assets were. I could see him being one that does generate some interest because he played at a World Cup. He's an international footballer. He's played in the Bundesliga. He's played in the Premier League. You can argue how well he did those things, but he did, and that's he's played significantly more games than Adam Eder is, as we've spoken about, and is much further along in my view. So I wouldn't. I've got to be honest. I wouldn't be really upset if he wasn't at Norwich City come the end of the summer. But I think he is someone that is a different type of striker and would need Norwich to play a little bit differently than they do at the moment to get the best out of. And it is interesting actually that I think his best football for Norwich has come under Dean Smith, which you couldn't say for a lot of players. So again, I think it's probably realigning with what David Wagner wants. So yeah, that's that. I'm a bit conflicted on Josh Sargent because there's a player there, and I think I just don't. I question whether he is exactly what Norwich need at this moment in time, but I would absolutely love to be proven wrong, and I hope he does that next season.
Awesome, chaps. Are we happy with everything? Are we happy with what we said? Anything to add?
It's a deep question, Ben. I mean, is anyone ever truly happy? But
let's go on for another 90 minutes, shall we? About if we're happy.
Yeah, I'm content. Yeah, with the conversation we've had. Yeah,
but just really quickly to touch on Connor's last comment. So much of it depends on what is the first offer that comes in for a player in, whenever July the 1st. So many moving parts then change from if that offer's acceptable, go, which player is it for? And then that sets off the chain reaction of a million other things, doesn't it?
Yeah, and what I would add is this summer Norwich don't hold the cards. In terms of that, before you look at the Buendia sale, you look at different positions they've been at different points with Aarons. They're not in that place this summer. If an offer comes in and it's decent, they will have to accept it. That's not a position that they've been in recent times, maybe beyond James Maddison, but I think the common consensus was he was going to leave irrespective of where Norwich were. So that's an interesting dynamic because they can't be as choosy as to who goes and who stays. And that's why what I said about Andrew Omobamidele, really, you can't choose who your assets are. Your assets are the ones that other clubs want to buy. Now, other clubs might look at it and go, don't fancy any of them after the season that they've just had. I don't think that will be the case. But if there could be a player that we've spoken about that one club feels really, really positively about and are willing to put money into, if that happens, then Norwich may well not have a choice as they have in recent summers.
Chaps, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk about a fairly miserable season. You've made it quite fun, so I am very thankful for that. For everyone watching, if you found your way to this channel, I'm sure you're already fans of and subscribe to the Pink and and all the stuff that Connor gets up to Ben and sort of the Benjamin Bloom football channel. It's all wonderful content. Ben, I'll be knocking on your door to try and get some East Anglian derby content for next season. It'll all be friendly and happy stuff. Connor,
God, I have to think about that again.
Yeah. Well, I think I'm probably perhaps more nervous than most Ipswich fans. But Connor, I'll be dragging you back here at some point. Thank you all very much for watching. In terms of content to come, we've got transfer videos, all that good stuff. Hopefully, during this podcast, I got a nice little confirmation text from Chris Gorham, so we'll have him on for an episode of the review. But until then, I'll see you again very, very soon.